let's take a look at the central nervous system. We're just starting out in chapter 12 of our Human Anatomy and Physiology text, and there's a lot of good reasons to get a leg up on understanding the nervous system, particularly if you'll be working with patients with any kind of brain or spinal cord injuries, strokes, traumas that cause deficits in function and need specialized kinds of care and understanding. Well, I'm just showing you this diagram to call to your attention the origin of the nervous system. It starts out as a cylinder of cells filled with fluid called the neural tube. And then it begins to specialize. You can see all kinds of changes happening in the cephalic-most part of the neural tube, the headmost part. And the different parts that are starting to form already that we see here in this diagram will give rise to things we can recognize in the brain when it's completely developed. Here's another representation of the same thing. Here we can see the cerebrum beginning to form and some other structures that we will be able to still recognize in the brain when it's completely developed. So kind of a remnant of that original construction as a tube filled with fluid, a cellular tube filled with fluid, is the presence of fluid-filled chambers or ventricles within the brain when it's completely developed. So these two arc-shaped structures are called lateral ventricles, hollow places in the two hemispheres of your cerebrum, connected by the interventricular foramina to the third ventricle, a thin chamber of fluid between the halves of the diencephalon, as we'll see later. And then from there, the cerebral aqueduct carries the cerebrospinal fluid down to the fourth ventricle, and then on down through the central canal of the spinal cord. Here's just another view of all those same structures, a lateral view of the same structures. So we'll be taking a closer look at some of those towards the end of chapter 12. The cerebrum has two structurally symmetrical hemispheres, and they're separated by a very deep fissure, it's called, a space in between those hemispheres. And here we can see the structures of the lateral view of the left hemisphere of the cerebrum, as well as the cerebellum and parts of the brain stem. All those ridges and grooves of the hemispheres of the cerebrum, what's that all about? The ridges are called gyri, or an individual gyrus, and each pair of gyri forms a little valley called a sulcus. The surface of the cerebrum is made up of gray matter, packed in cell bodies of neurons. And in order to create more space for more neurons, in order to create more processing power for the cerebrum, the surface is made up into lots of inward infoldings. Folds that produce more space, more surface area. And that's what these ridges, these gyri are. And so each sulcus is part of that folding structure. There are some places where there's a much deeper separation as between the hemispheres called a fissure. There's 5 lobes of the cerebrum you should be able to identify. The frontal lobe, which underlies the frontal bone, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And then the lateral sulcus can be pried apart. It's a rather deep sulcus, and down underneath the temporal, frontal, and parietal lobes we see another little lobe called the insula, number 5. Much of what we know about the function of the different parts of the brain came from years and years of studying people who had had brain injuries, strokes, traumas, congenital defects, and so forth, and discovering in great detail what each individual could and could not do compared to the typical average person, and then after death, dissecting the brain to identify the location of the lesions and make the connections. Now, of course, we've taken leaps ahead in the last couple of decades with the advent of very interesting complex imaging methodologies where we can see increases in blood flow and metabolism in real time in the brain. So when some part of your brain starts processing more, it starts taking up more glucose and oxidizing it, and more blood flows in order to supply the oxygen and so forth. So we can get quite a detailed look at the pattern of regions of the brain that come online when we challenge the brain with specific mental tasks. Well, here's a cartoon showing the lobes of the cerebrum, and we can see that we've sort of marked out some subregions also. So let's take a look at some of the functional regions of the frontal lobe, motor regions and so forth. And then we'll look at some functional regions of the other lobes, some sensory regions. The central sulcus is a good landmark to begin sort of understanding what's what in the cerebrum. It divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This sulcus right here. The first gyrus anterior to that is called the precentral gyrus. It's the primary motor cortex. Pyramidal neurons, as in the word pyramid, arise all in this gyrus and travel right down into the spinal cord and synapse with lower motor neurons that control all your skeletal muscles. So from here can be controlled all the skeletal muscles of your body. But it's like sitting in front of a keyboard console. It won't play itself. The premotor cortex, the next anterior gyrus, is a planning area that can start to develop a scheme for the complex sequence and timing of muscle contractions that will allow you to move your body where you want it to go. Accomplish the task that you want to accomplish. It's also the location where skill memories are stored. Once you learn how to do a certain motor task, you practice and practice, like on the piano or some athletic maneuver like a corner kick in soccer, you store the memory for that so that you can just go right back to it and re-execute that same pattern of muscle contractions on the primary motor cortex, and you don't have to reinvent it each time. It's also important to remember that the primary motor cortex in one hemisphere controls the skeletal muscles on the contralateral side of the body, the opposite side of the body. So there's a crossing over of the axons for the pyramidal neurons in the anterior of the brainstem we'll see later. There's also another motor area called the frontal eye field that controls the little muscles that point your eyes where you want them to go. And there's another motor area called Broca's area that's a motor speech area. So in some other part of your cortex, you'll choose the words you want to say, the meaning of the message you want to convey, and here's where you can actually control the muscles of the larynx and the tongue and the lips and the airways and so forth to produce the sounds that you want to produce, muscles of respiration. The frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, all kinds of abstract and high-level thinking processes originate here in this area. Look at some of these things in this list, some really cool things. Solving complex problems, being able to hold multiple pieces of memory information in your conscious mind at once in order to execute various thinking tasks and management tasks, executive tasks, spatial memory functions, your personality, what makes you you, why you do the unique things that you do in a given situation, your sense of morality, judgment, fairness, all kinds of high-level thinking processes. Also, when you want to execute some motor function, you develop a goal for what you want to do in the prefrontal cortex, and then the premotor cortex can start developing a plan for how to actually accomplish that task by controlling the primary motor cortex. If we go to the postcentral gyrus, the first gyrus posterior to the central sulcus, is the primary somatosensory cortex. All the sensory neurons that provide information about stimuli that you can consciously be aware of terminate right here in this gyrus. So really amazing and cool organization. But it's just a listing out kind of neurons that are being activated by stimuli. What does it all mean? In order to find that out, we need to scope out the memories that are stored in the association cortex. Whenever we have a pattern of sensations, we store a memory of it in the association cortex just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. And then by comparing the current pattern of sensations with stored memories, we can begin to perceive the nature of the stimuli. What is it that's touching or impacting my body? Also, the sensory neurons from one side of the body arrive in the contralateral side of the cerebrum, hemisphere of the cerebrum. All right, so there's other sensory cortices we should notice. The gustatory cortex is in the insula, an association. That's where we have the sense of taste. The primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobe. All the neurons from the retinas send their stimuli to the primary visual cortex. It's just a series of dark spots, light spots, colored spots, things moving. In order to understand the significance of the objects in our field of view, we refer to the association area where we stored a lifetime of memories there of things that we've seen before so that we can understand or perceive what it is we're looking at. And there's an association cortex, an auditory, primary auditory cortex and association cortex in the temporal lobe, as well as another auditory association cortex called Wernicke's area. It's a language interpretation center. So when you hear sounds that can have symbolic meaning of words, you'll hash that out in the Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere of your cerebrum. And here's a mid-sagittal cut right through and separating the two hemispheres so that we can look at the lateral point of view of the left hemisphere from that mid-sagittal plane, just so that we can see the olfactory cortex is in the temporal lobe also, but on the medial surface, the so-called uncus, and an association cortex there. It's the only sensory pathway that involves, here's the olfactory bulbs where the olfactory sensory inputs come in, and they travel, the impulses travel directly to the same hemisphere and are associated there. I should mention, the only thing that we had to cut in order to separate the two hemispheres like we've done here, I guess this isn't quite the mid-sagittal plane, we're a little bit to the right. This is the corpus callosum, it's called. And it's the place where all the axons are that cross between the left and right hemispheres so the two hemispheres can talk to each other. All the myelinated axons are here, and we've cut through them all in the corpus callosum. Here's the fornix, another structure of the cerebrum, which we'll just see it grouped together with some other structures later in the limbic system. These two interesting maps are called homunculi, or an individual homunculus. I don't think it's on here. Homunculus, H-U-M-U-N-C-U-L-U-S, a lot of U's. Homunculus. And what it's representing is all the parts of the primary motor cortex that control muscles in different parts of your body. So you can see that a lot of your primary motor cortex is taken up with pyramidal neurons that control the muscles in your hands. You have a lot of fine motor control of your hands. You have a lot of fine motor control of the muscles in your face for facial expression. So that takes up a lot of your motor neurons in your primary motor cortex. Whereas the the muscles of your trunk, your thighs, and your lower legs, those motor neurons control huge motor units. So there's not as many different motor neurons, and so less of the motor cortex is dedicated to controlling those huge muscle groups that can easily manage the weight of your body and everything you're carrying. Here's a somatosensory homunculus. We're looking at which parts of the primary somatosensory cortex receive inputs from which part of your body. So again, a lot of sensory neurons are packed in your face, your oral cavity and so forth, so that takes up a lot of the surface of your primary somatosensory cortex. A lot of sensory neurons packed in your hands for fine discrimination so that you can manage fine motor tasks using your fingers and your hands, so forth. Not such dense packing of motor neurons in your trunk and your legs. But look at your feet. Ton of sensory receptors in your plantar surface of your feet so that you can walk around and have good discrimination of the stimuli that are on the ground you're stepping on so you don't damage your feet. You're very able to quickly sense what's under your feet and reflexively escape from danger. Well, the hemispheres have a structural sort of symmetry about them. They look similar, but they're not entirely similar in function. So it turns out that most people have a left-sided dominance. The left hemisphere is dominant over the right hemisphere, and it usually corresponds to right-handedness. 10% of the people have a left or a right, hemisphere dominance and are left-handed. The left hemisphere is a little different. It contains circuits that are involved in math capabilities and specialized for language, logical thinking. Broca's area and Wernicke's area are typically in the left hemisphere. whereas the right hemisphere is more geared towards spatial skills, intuition, intuitive thinking, this kind of like gut feeling kind of thinking, emotional control of thoughts, and artistic and musical skills. So you've probably heard those things before, and most people are, again, left hemisphere dominant, but lefties tend to be more right hemisphere dominant and have more of these kinds of, typically these kinds of skills more refined and more developed than typically is so. The hemispheres communicate by way of the fiber tracts. Tracts are just what we call the axons of neurons in the central nervous system in the corpus callosum. This cartoon just shows three different sort of arrangements of axon tracks in the cerebrum and in the brain. The green lines represent tracks traveling from one hemisphere to the other. So that's a look at in this coronal section of part of the corpus callosum. Those are called commissural fibers that cross over from one side of the brain to the other. Fibers that connect from one part of a hemisphere to another part of the same hemisphere are called association fibers. And fibers that travel from, in this case, the motor cortex all the way straight down into the spinal cord and to control the skeletal muscles, those are called projection fibers. You can see this is a great dissection to show you the visual difference between white matter, myelinated axons here in the brain, and the gray matter, the packing in of neuron cell bodies in the cortex of the cerebrum. So that's the cortex's cell bodies, it's gray matter. You'll see some more gray matter in a bit. This mid-sagittal kind of section shows the same three types of fibers just from a different point of view. In this case, we're looking at sensory fibers coming up from, they didn't show them coming up through the spinal cord and brainstem, but they have to synapse in the thalamus. So these are just the sensory fibers coming from the thalamus, as we'll see later, to different parts of the cortex. But yet again, it's called projection fibers. So as I've already kind of alluded, in the central nervous system, regions where we find neuron cell bodies is called gray matter. And we have gray matter in the cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum. But yet down deep in the cerebrum are clusters of neuron cell bodies called nuclei. The diencephalon, the thalamus and hypothalamus, are made up of clusters or nuclei, clusters of neurons. Wherever we have myelinated axons, that's called white matter, and also another term that I've used already is tracts, tracts of axons. Whereas in the peripheral nervous system, wherever you may find clusters of cell bodies where there's synapses between pairs of neurons, those would be called ganglia. Myelinated axons traveling in the periphery in your body are always packaged up with some protective connective tissue coverings in structures we call nerves. Here we see a group of structures that together are known as the basal nuclei. So, as the name implies, these are areas where there's deep regions within the cerebrum made up of neuron cell bodies. Here's a transverse section that shows you, again, parts of the basal nuclei, and you can, those are gray matter, and you can see here in this dissection very well that indeed those structures are gray matter. They're made up of neuron cell bodies. You can also see the thalamus, which will be coming to in part 2 of our discussion, more nuclei that are there. You can also see part of the ventricles we talked about earlier. The two lateral ventricles are here. The third ventricle sits between the halves of the diencephalon. And we'll again look at that a bit later. So what do the basal nuclei actually do? They have function in attention, mainly your ability to focus your attention on things for a sustained period of time. And they have some important motor functions. They're responsible for patterning the intensity of slow or stereotyped movements. So when your premotor cortex is planning out just walking, simple, slow movements of your body, it'll solicit advice on how to fine-tune that motor plan from the basal nuclei by way of the thalamus as kind of a switchboard in between. And so that's a contribution the thalamus can make. The thalamus also holds things still in your motor cortex until you're ready to execute a motor plan. So we can hold everything still until the basal nuclei finally say, go, and that's when we initiate the motor plan that the premotor cortex is now holding. It can execute that on the primary motor cortex. How do we know these things? Well, initially because when certain neurons in the midbrain, part of the brainstem, die, neurons in the substantia nigra, they're dopaminergic neurons, meaning they have dopamine as their neurotransmitter. Once they die, we have a disease called Parkinson's disease. And what happens is there's an intimate connection between the substantia nigra and the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei no longer function properly after that, and we have difficulty starting movement plans or changing from one movement plan to another. The person with advanced Parkinson's disease exhibits a slow shuffling gait when they walk. They have a slack facial expression, drooped shoulders. So the motor functions that the basal nuclei normally perform are not being controlled properly. And it's a progressive disease, gets worse and worse, and there's no cure for it. Well, join me next time as we'll start talking about the diencephalon and the function of those fascinating parts of your brain, and on down into the brainstem and the spinal cord.